The path forward can be found only by Jews and Muslims, Arabs, who are moderate, who believe in democracy, and want to fight fundamentalism in their society. That for me is the only path forward. It has not made me in any way more right wing or more sympathetic to the right by any means. It has made me convinced that the left needed to be completely reconstructed. And by the way, if the extreme right has become so powerful in so many places, I think it has to do with the failure of the left. It's not the only reason. Obviously, there are many other reasons, but one of them cannot not be that the left has lost its way. And October 7th, I think I already suspected that very strongly. That is certainly the case in Israel. That is something I discuss in my book. The reason when I try to understand why Netanyahu became such a plausible political option for the working class. I discussed the tremendous failure of the Israeli left. And I have become even more convinced of that this is not only about the Israeli left, it's about many lefts in the world.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustabia, on fait le bunga, bunga, Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, welcome to Aufhe Bunga Bunga, or Bungacast for short, the global politics podcast at the end of history. My name is Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil, and for the past 7 years, this podcast has been trying to explore the contours of the breakdown of the neoliberal order, what's emerging, and what comes next. So in view of that, I'm very happy to announce that in today's episode, I speak to the renowned Franco-Israeli sociologist Eva Illouz about how capitalism uses our emotions, about ideas like rationalization and alienation, and about victimhood. I also take the opportunity to ask Eva Illouz, who's a regular contributor to Haaretz and Le Monde, about the situation in Israel, about Netanyahu as an entrepreneur of fear, and the failures and fallouts from the 7th of October attacks. Now, this episode also serves as the concluding episode in a series of sorts that we've done on affect and the emotional turn, taking in topics such as political anger, the uses and abuses of trauma, whether disengagement today is resentful or resigned, and vulnerability and mental health. So if you want to check all that out, see the link in the show notes to Emotion Sickness, the Politics of Feelings, which includes guests Catherine Liu, Nina Power, and Ashley Frawley. Now, if you're new to Bungacast, we put out a new episode every single Tuesday, with additional episodes most Thursdays. 2 of our episodes every month are entirely free, such as this one here. The rest is available in full only at patreon.com/Bungacast. There you'll find episodes with our regular contributors, Alex Gurevich, Catherine Liu, Amber Lee Frost, and Lee Phillips. Think of them as regular columnists. There's also episodes with writers and editors from Damage Magazine with whom we're partnered. And if you subscribe to our Patreon, you also get a free subscription to Damage Magazine, and I encourage you to do so. There's also plenty from the Bunga Boys, that is Phil, George, and myself. If you subscribe for $12 a month, you get access to everything we do. So that includes membership of the Bungacast Reading Club. Coming up this month, we present Julien Bonda's classic 1927 work, The Treason of the Intellectuals, a book that's probably a lot more cited than it is read. But we did read it, and we read it with you. In Bonda's time, it was the intellectuals' adoption of nationalist particularism that was the biggest crime as he saw it. But what about today? What should we expect from intellectuals in a time of conformity and of the bureaucratization and commodification of thought, especially as we reach the end of a period of globalization, just as Bonda experienced in 1914? For everything minus the reading club, you can sign up for just $7 a month. Here's what you might have missed over the past month. We discussed academic populism and the culture wars with Catherine Liu, Ukraine's de-development and its war with Volodymyr Ishchenko, the French elections with Charles de Varenne, and us, that is Phil, George, and myself, on Britain's elections and Starmer's hollow victory. Coming up in August, we have J.D. Vance and his Hillbilly Elegy, which we discuss with Ryan Zickgraf, Lee Jones and Shahar Hameri on the myth of China as a monolithic state, the colonization of civil society by the NGO with Matt Thompson and Johnny Gordon Farley, and as many of us jet off on summer holidays, has tourism jumped the shark? How is this massive industry turning cities effectively into company towns? Is there any way to be critical of this process without succumbing to the sort of snobbery that usually accompanies critiques of tourism? If this all sounds good, come over and join us at patreon.com/Bungacast. We'd love to see you there. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Eva Illouz, who's professor of sociology at the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris, or EHESS. She's the author of a number of books. I'm just going to cite a couple here. Cold Intimacies, Consuming the Romantic Utopia, Oprah Winfrey and the Glamour of Misery, and The Emotional Life of Populism. Now, longtime listeners of Bungacast will probably recognize a few of these titles as we've discussed them on here in the past. So all the more reason for me to be very excited to welcome Eva onto the podcast. Hi, Eva. How are you?
Hi, Alex. I'm delighted to be here.
Excellent. Where are you joining us from? Are you joining us from Paris?
Yes, I am Paris.
Okay, excellent. So we're going to be talking, I think, firstly, maybe about populism and the affect of populism. And your book deals specifically with the Israeli case, though no doubt there are kind of wider applications to some of that analysis. So to get started, your critique of populism, or what you call populism, and Israeli populism in particular, seizes on four different affects or feelings: fear, disgust, resentment, and love. Now, this is maybe a bit of a broad question, but given the events of the past year in Israel, and this is probably unnecessary to resume, but the mass protests against judicial reform, the 7th of October attacks, and the war in Gaza, what would you say is the predominant emotion or mood in Israel right now? Maybe, or if you were to, select from your typology of four affects?
Oh, I don't think it's actually suitable to characterize what is happening right now in Israel. My book was really about the kind of emotions that are engineered by politicians. This does not summarize the entire political arena because it can be dominated by other actors, such as civil society. Right now, and during the protests, as you mentioned, the mood was decided more or less by the protesters and their emotions, even though I would say they are organized. Of course, they're organized by the protest organizers. They are organized by the narratives that the media circulate, but they are not as carefully engineered by an army of marketing political consultants. I was interested in that book, in the kind of narratives that a politician like Netanyahu crafts in order to manipulate his voters. So these are very different perspectives, if you want. It's a level of emotion that is, I would say, much less engineered and much more spontaneous, and that emerges from whatever collective experience the country is going through.
Right. So, I mean, would you say that in the current moment, and particularly over the past year, that these politicians, and particularly Netanyahu, have lost control of the narrative and been less capable of sort of engineering a narrative or set of emotions that suit them?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I would say yes, that Netanyahu has lost control of the narrative, although he periodically tries to regain control, for example, by accusing the army of fomenting a kind of revolt against him, or for being responsible for his own failures and mistake. Um, so I would say today it's more of a struggle between him and public opinion on of narratives. In other words, they are, I think, times where politicians can craft their narratives unhindered, and some media go along, and civil society go along. And there are times where these narratives are severely contested. This is the case now. So his narrative is not so much audible, and he doesn't have, I think, a clear narrative, actually, except we will exterminate them.
Right. I mean, at the risk of getting into something which I wanted to leave for a little bit later, to what extent does that have or create a point of contact between himself and the citizenry?
So I think it's you're you're asking you started with the difficult questions, because I think it's a very rare situation of crisis in which a leader failed miserably at his own policy. He's entangled into trials. He's suspected for waging a long war in order to evade his accusations. So all of this creates enormous mistrust vis-a-vis Netanyahu. So I would say that almost nothing that he can say today, at least with 50% of the population, perhaps more, but I would say with at least half of the population, nothing he can say will really be believed. However, at the very beginning, I think the sense of outrage and grief and fear was so strong that the narrative of we will get them and exterminate them was worked, but it's no longer working, actually. More and more people are contesting the validity of this aim. More and more people believe this war cannot be actually ended, that it would be a catastrophe for Israel to draw Hezbollah on the north inside the war. So I think Netanyahu is not able. It's quite remarkable when you think of it, how unable he was to use the grief, the immense grief and fear that existed in order to position himself. And Netanyahu, who is the master, I think he's a master artist, con artist, in the use of fear, was unable, because what you needed was a kind of very personal way of connecting with the Israeli population. You needed some paternal figure to comfort people and to give them a sense of warmth before even security. And I think Netanyahu, as a human being, is truly incapable of that. And so he entirely failed, he spectacularly failed even to, I would say, even instrumentalize or exploit the tremendous sense of disorientation and vulnerability that Israelis were feeling. The only thing he did, of course, was to use it in a narrative of revenge. That was all he knew how to do, but that's not enough.
Fascinating. That I find that very interesting, and I do want to return to that question in a little bit later on. But now I wanted to turn to your academic and scholarly biography, I guess, and start by asking you what motivated you in the first place to study emotions. What did you feel was lacking in our collective understanding of these matters that you wanted to correct?
So, I think quite often when we choose a topic, it's actually quite often more autobiographical than we dare to acknowledge. And I think it is autobiographical in the sense that we often choose things that don't work for us. And it's when we feel that the world is an obstacle for us in a certain domain, I think we're going to be attracted often to that in order to bring some clarification to that domain that is not working or that resists our intentions, to speak like phenomenologists. So I think for me, as an adolescent, I was very standard. I always joke that I grew up as an adolescent being Madame Bovary. I read romance novels. I believed, or rather than believed, I fantasized about romantic love, only to find out to my dismay that the real world was far more complex than that. So I would say that my attraction to romantic love came from that kind of Madame Bovary moment, only that fortunately I did not commit suicide like her, but I had the university and books and sociology to help me figure it out. Then I think, sometimes you choose a topic also because of the serendipity of your readings. I had read Fragment d'un discours amoureux by Roland Barthes. His I'm not sure how it is translated in English. Love discourse, maybe.
I'm not sure myself.
It's a very famous book of his and quite stunning, a very interesting book. And that convinced me that if a, if a semiologist was writing about romantic love, then I could indeed choose that as a topic. And then I would say there is a third answer, which is that I think sociology, if you look at the beginning of sociology, especially on the French side, so when Durkheim starts writing about the suicide, which is really one of the founding texts of sociology, um, and what he finds actually is that suicide is not really an individual pathology. It's actually much more likely to emerge within one group rather than in another. So that's one way to say it's not only the emotions, or rather, if there are emotions that lead someone to commit suicide, these emotions should be understood in the context of membership to a group. And that, I think, is what I find particularly fascinating in sociology. It is that it is this idea that the inner life is not ours really, or never only ours. It is very much crisscrossed by all kinds of forces, images, symbols, languages we are not really aware of. So that's what I found really interesting. And also, I think, lastly, I think I grew up like everybody else of my generation in a culture that was overwhelmed with discussions on emotions. Everybody needed to open up and to work on themselves. And I found it profoundly puzzling that um, emotions would have become such an object of collective obsession. And I think that's what my work set on, in fact, dealing with, at least a part of it, which is how do we come to be so obsessed by emotions? Because that seemed to counter some of the diagnostics of modernity that many sociologists had given us, namely that we were moving to an impersonal, alienated, rationalized world. So I would say these are, in a nutshell, the things that pushed me in that direction.
No, that's great. And I, one thing that struck me just hearing you say that is your interest in the depicting the kind of social foundations for emotions, I guess, or the way that people's intimate lives are kind of traversed by wider social forces. That this is something which runs against one of the prejudices of the age, I think, which locates emotion purely within the self as if it kind of has emerged out of nothing, a kind of very reductive notion of, well, I guess of emotion, right? And a very individualistic and atomistic understanding.
So I wouldn't reductivist, I think each discipline it can be guilty of its own reductivism. So I'm not sure that psychological reductivism is the thing I have in mind. Um, it's more that I am always asking myself, um, can we be differently from what we are? There is I remember a sociologist or historian of sexuality asking, why is it that sexuality has become so important to us? And when I read that question, it was a long time ago, I was so struck by it because it never occurred to me to put into question this idea that sexuality should be, in fact, a value that we hold dear only relatively recently. And in fact, if you look at the history of sexuality, you really understand why sexuality has become such important only really in the 19th and 20th century. So I would say that what really interests me is this idea that we have, that whatever we experience, whatever we go through in life, is of our own doing. And that is a very widespread psychological thinking, way of thinking about, I would say, our miseries. And I say this because I find myself also sometimes not able to resist that kind of thinking, so powerful it is. So the idea is, if you've been fired from your job or cannot find a stable relationship or live in a state of loneliness, the idea is that there is something in your unconscious you should absolutely deal with. I'm not saying it's entirely wrong, but I'm saying this way of thinking has at least two effects. One is to make people focus intensely on this, who they are and what they feel, and constantly bring up what they feel with others. That's one thing. The other thing is that it completely changes the frames of explanation and causality. So for me, causality is absolutely crucial to social life, how you explain things, how you explain bad things, especially like secular theodicies. Theodicy is, an explanation of why things are so bad when actually they do not correspond to the effort or the moral virtue or the moral merit you have. This, I think, is really what really compels me in this analysis of emotions, which is something that psychologists cannot provide because they are part, in my opinion, of an enormous ideological machine whose aim is to make a completely disorganized individual life more tolerable and more manageable.
Yeah, so it's about effectively adapting and coping. So one other thing that I wanted to draw upon and to discuss with you is this notion of emotional capitalism and the role that you attribute, or the analysis that you build around emotional life and its relationship to capitalist development and capitalist modernity. That you noted already, about 5-10 minutes ago, that the way that sociology has generally treated this, if not relegated emotion, treated the development of capitalism as complicit with a diminishment of emotion, effectively privileging cold calculation, rationalization, perhaps a kind of acquisitiveness associated to that, but nevertheless, something where emotion doesn't play a central role. So what did you want to kind of bring to sociology and to the study of the development of capitalist relations in terms of inserting this important question of emotions into it?
So, you mentioned the notion of emotional capitalism, which is something I worked on a long, long time ago. I was trying to grasp two converging processes. The first was that emotions have been extraordinarily stimulated by consumer culture. And in that, I don't say anything original. The students of consumption, and especially, for example, advertising, know how much consumption depends on the elicitation of very specific emotions. And in a way, we can say that the world of endless objects that consumer culture provides us with is, or reaches us, comes to us with embedded in a world of feelings, sensations, and emotions. But that is definitely not terribly original to say that. The second thing I said in this idea that capitalism has very much used emotions, which is a little bit less trivial, it is that emotions have become commodified. This is where I came up with a notion of immodity. This is in another book called Emotions as Commodities. I think that's the name of the book, in which me and a group of students, we looked at the emergence of types of commodities that are purchased as emotions. That is, it's not that the emotion is added or comes along, let's say the racy car, but it is that the emotion, that the thing itself is supposed to provide an emotion. So when you're going to Club Med on vacation, you're purchasing the relaxation and all the apparatus that is being set up in order for you to experience what we call, and that's also a new emotion, relaxation. Relaxation, which is the opposite of stress. Everything is done in order to de-stress you. When you are going to an anger management workshop, what you're purchasing is actually the technique in order to change your emotional makeup. When you're buying an a pill to manage your social anxiety, you're doing the same, or something to put you in a good mood. And so there is, in fact, an extraordinary amount of commodities who are, or of objects, if you want, that are simply the vectors, the material vectors for the emotions. So if I said before that you're purchasing something material and it is associated with some emotional meanings, here the object becomes actually not important, and it is the emotion that is important. So that's one aspect of capitalism. It is the, if you want, the emotionalization of the economy here that interested me. The second aspect that very much interested me is the ways in which we have made our emotions to really correspond or fit or adopt the values of the market in different ways. I'll give two different examples of what I mean. So when people calculate who they will meet or who they will be friend with, or calculate the cost and benefit of a relationship, of an intimate relationship, I'm interested by the mindset, if you want, by the type of utilitarian language that people use in these relationships. Here again, I was not so I was not so innovative at all, because Robert Bella had done beautiful study on the utilitarianism that had penetrated interpersonal relationships, only that he did not connect it specifically, I think, to capitalism. There is a second sense which I find more fascinating and much more even relevant. It is the ways in which we made our personal life actually now become a raw commodity. So if you are an influencer and you are using your daily life as a way to cast yourself as a commodity, um, you are in fact making the people who follow you, they are following your daily life, you're following your emotions, and you are transforming these emotions into kind of raw materials. Um, and look at the extraordinary expansion also of, for example, the trauma discourse. What is a trauma discourse? It is the capacity to marketize. It is made possible by the capacity, on the one hand, to treat, to have a therapeutic treatment, a medical discourse, to treat trauma. On the other hand, it is also a marketable slice of your life, event of your life, which, let's say, destroyed you psychically, and which you are going to share with readers in the form of a book or a narrative. So the raw material of capitalism after the 1970s or 80s become increasingly emotions, and with the internet, this tendency even accentuates, as it is daily life itself that has become the raw material. So it's really a kind of um, cannibalistic form of capitalism, because it deals with, or it uses the life itself, the life
Hmm. So I wondered, in thinking about this conversation that we're having now, and reading your work and rereading some of it as well, that whether you see one of these elements as being chronologically or maybe logically prior to the other. So I mean, to spell this out, you describe this sort of dialectical move of kind of the warm stuff into the cold stuff and the cold stuff into the warm stuff, or to put it differently, that capitalist production demands this input increasingly of affect, of emotion, and at the same time the intimate sphere is reconstructed on the basis of bargaining and exchange, all that kind of much more cold and calculating aspects of capitalism, and the stuff that people refer to when they say capitalism, they normally, I think, are thinking of that aspect of things. Do you see one as having come first?
So let me correct a wrong impression I may have given. I don't think we are colder actually under capitalism than we used to be.
Mm.
Certainly, marriages were not, in the past, were not such a hot affair. If anything, I would say that the strong distinction between private life and the market that comes along with capitalism makes us far more hot, in, to use your terminology, far more hot, far more emotional, and the family is much more conceived as an emotional hothouse,
Mm.
to use the words of the historian John Demos. Um, what I think happens more, I think what is the distinctive characteristic of a life under capitalism is, first of all, the amount of interactions we have with others. That is, I think, qualitatively new. We never had so many interactions before. Um, and then there is also norms of disinterestedness, paradoxically, that were less present, I think, in pre-capitalist cultures. In pre-capitalist cultures, interest and non-interest are very much intertwined. And it is taken for granted that you, for example, choose as your friends people who can help you or are of your own social class. Disinterestedness becomes much more important precisely after the emergence of the market and the emergence of the family as a hothouse. So, so that is a caveat I wanted to put in place. At the same time, I think that the market socializes everybody, men and women, to be highly self-interested actors. Women used to be the self-sacrificing agent between the two. The woman used to be the one who would not think about her interest and self-sacrifice. No longer. No longer, both because of feminism and because the market demands that you become self-interested and self-centered. So so in a way, along with this norm of disinterestedness, you have two people, for example, in heterosexual or homosexual relationships, interacting very much on the basis of their interest, actually. Um, so that's one thing I wanted to say. The second, which concerns the question of chronology, what is before what?
Well, I mean, I suspect that the answer might not be, so clear cut because these things rarely are. But that the rationalization of the intimate sphere, so I'm thinking of things like the way that people approach dating today, where you have, on Tinder you can optimize your process by which you might find a mate or a romantic partner. That's one side of the equation, and the other side of the equation is what you've been describing in terms of the creation of emotional commodities, and a longer history indeed of the use of emotion in marketing and selling. Do you see one as having come first? Because I asked the question, I guess, because for me, just kind of observing the social world, it seems to me that the rationalization of the intimate sphere is something which is a little bit more recent. But that
So
might just be a
if the
prejudice of
example
mine.
you use is the internet, then, well, obviously it's contained in the title of what you just said. So I want to clarify that rationalization, as you use it here, is a bit different from utilitarianism that I was talking about before. That is this idea that people meet as highly interested and competitive and self-reliant actors. Because rationalization, that's also another aspect of my work, presupposes techniques and rules to make your emotions much more controllable, much more knowable, and in themselves the object of something you want to maximize. In that respect, an internet dating site is a very good example of that process, where using the site, you learn about your preferences, exactly like an economic actor. Whereas maybe if you never used an internet dating site, you never really asked yourself, what are the four top qualities I require in someone, for example. So that, according to Max Weber, this kind of spelling out your preferences, and not only spelling it out, but also using a technology uh, to um, to make it known and to meet someone else. This is rationalization. That is, it is making the process of meeting someone increasingly or seemingly increasingly controllable, something that you can from the beginning to the end have the impression that you are directing. Completely different from, let's say, the idea of love at first sight. because in love at first sight, the whole point is that something that you absolutely do not control happens to you. So if you contrast it with a love at first sight, I think this idea of rationalization is much clearer. So I think, of course, you're right. It's also almost obviously contained in the example we've been using, which is the technology. I think technology have been extraordinarily rationalizing encounters, the process of encountering someone, for example, by organizing also the set of possible partners exactly like a market. So before the internet, you could meet in January Paul, and then in March Christian, and then in June you could meet Philip. But now Paul and Christian and Philip are arrayed one near the other, exactly as in a market situation, as in a buffet. And you have to, well, actually not choose. You can try all of them. So in a way, it's a cornucopia of choice. It's the wildest dream of capitalism, in a way, to try anything you want to try. And this, by the way, also, if you look at the analysis of Max Weber of rationality and rationalization, Max Weber said that the tremendous irony of modernity is that there were more and more rules, there were more and more attempts to control what we were doing, but this rationality was underlined by a tremendous irrationality, that in fact people, or that in fact we were getting further away from what gave meaning to, for example, our lives. These sites may rationalize tremendously the process of encountering someone, but often people meet so many, and it's fruitless, that it has become a kind of endeavor for its own sake, and it has no real aim anymore. It is its own machine that is launched and that works almost on empty.
Now, I think I know what the answer is to the next question that I have, because it relates closely to what you've been discussing. But if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong, you've argued that in fact today emotional dynamics, I think that the extent and the range of emotion is actually attenuated or more limited at the same time that subjectivism and emotivism has increased. And that seems, maybe it might seem counterintuitive to a lot of people, that you might have this kind of contradictory motion. So could you maybe explain that for us?
I think subjectivity is actually quite central to contemporary capitalism. By this I mean, and again, I don't think I'm original at all by that, that it's not only, it is not only that capitalism has, consumer culture constructed us as creatures of desires and pleasure and excitement and novelty. And that is because this is most compatible with the very fact of consumption. So it's not only that it has constructed a very specific type of subjectivity, one that is sensuous, focused on the senses, on the experiences, and on pleasure. But also it is that, in fact, I think we think of the good life in the terms that capitalism has set up for us. For example, this idea of choice, this idea that life should be exciting and should not be in any way boring. And I would say the third thing is this thing I mentioned before, the idea that subjectivity itself is experienced as something increasingly that can be monetized and marketed. So, so, um, so not only, so in other words, what I want to say is that contrary to this idea that we're all robots and appendages to the machine and impersonalized by overwhelming, oppressive, bureaucratic organizations, which is all true as well. We have been made, on the contrary, highly individualized, highly singular subjects, very preoccupied with their with achieving emotional goals, emotional plans, pleasures. In other words, we have been subjectivized, and because consumer culture works only if you take your own self and its singularity highly seriously. Otherwise, it cannot work. And the work of consuming is a work of accentuating your singularity at the end and at the same time. And then it's another process that goes along with that, making in return, that singularity something that you can actually trade and you can make tradable. And the internet has been an incredible source for treating, I would say, merchandising, commodifying these singularities. I'm not sure if I was clear.
No, I think that that is very clear, and it leads me on, I think, very nicely to the next question, which is about the impact in class terms of emotional capitalism as we experience it today. I think somewhere you suggest that under classical modernity, the demands of bourgeois morality fell harder on the middle class than they did on the working class, because it was the middle class which sought to conform to the rigors of what bourgeois morality demanded of it, and that created all sorts of neuroses, etc. Whereas the working class was, to a certain degree, actually freer, or somehow untouched by these demands. The new disposition of the new contemporary emotional capitalism and all that you've been describing, I think, do you suggest that this is more of a challenge for the working class, precisely because the working class would be less skilled and have fewer resources for navigating this new world than the professional middle class does?
So, first of all, I think you referred to a text of Freud I discussed, in which Freud constructs this distinction between the working class, who are so called or presumably more free and less inhibited, and the middle class.
Yeah.
And that is the reason why that is to a certain extent true, is because the middle class tends to work in bureaucratic organizations. And bureaucratic organizations demand a very tight emotional labor. This is the expression that Arlie Hochschild had coined, and I think it's a very good notion. I mean, a very important one. Emotional labor is the labor that you have to achieve if you want to live in if you want to work in a bureaucratic organization, and most people today work in a bureaucratic organization. So in other words, they have to control their anger, they have to accept the moods and whims of sometimes erratic bosses. They have to show friendliness to colleagues, impersonal friendliness, but friendliness. So that kind of emotional labor is, in a way, it's interesting because this is what both Freud suggests and Arlie Hochschild suggests. Differently, I mean, Arlie Hochschild didn't read, I think, this text by Freud. But what they suggest is that there is a form of alienation in that kind of self-control. So on the one hand, you are accumulating what we could call emotional capital, because you're trying to show yourself emotionally adapted to the to working with others, or to managing others. On the other hand, you have to control so much of yourself, suppress so much of yourself, say Freud and Hochschild, that you, in fact, you end up being alienated. And people who do not work in organizations, then you understand, are not that alienated. So that was, I think, more or less what I was trying to say. But I don't subscribe, if you want, to the view that to Freud's texts, according to which I think it's a stereotype and a cliche that the working class would be more raw in a way, which would mean also more primitive, and that the working class and the middle class are more inhibited. Or I think what I was interested in is saying is that the type of emotions that middle class men work on is better suited to the expectations of women, and that women have been so influenced by therapeutic culture that they have entirely subscribed to this idea that you have to work on your emotions and express them and be intimate and be expressive and so on and so forth. And that this culture of emotional expressiveness and control, both, is very much a middle class idea of emotions that often doesn't suit the lives, the work lives of working class men, and that therefore working class men are often at odds with the women because they do not provide or do not correspond to these middle class prototypes of intimacy and emotion management.
Do you see that changing, particularly, I mean, across Western societies, as men are increasingly encouraged to, to talk about their emotions and to engage in this sort of therapeutic work? Do you see this kind of shift underway?
There is a shift, but I don't know. When I say I don't know, it means I don't know. I don't know if it concerns all men or if this is mostly true about college educated men. Because you see also a kind of backlash of men refusing what they feel or perceive as being a castration of their masculinity. There is a strong backlash in that direction, and a
Yeah.
refusal of men precisely to correspond to those, in their view, castrated ideals of masculinity. And
Indeed,
so,
I suspect that this actually is manifest in a certain political polarization today
absolutely,
as well.
absolutely, yes. So, Trump, for example, I think, um, I mean, not only Trump, but if you think of Bolsonaro and Milei and Putin and Erdogan, they all correspond almost perfectly. I mean, it's as if they came out of a feminist textbook on what hegemonic and toxic masculinity is. You could not have constructed them better, I think, as prototypes of that kind of masculinity. And I think overall, these more men in general vote for these men. There is a gender gap in the populist vote, which is also a highly masculinist vote. So that could be also explained as, what I said before, backlash against
A rejection of the sort of therapeutic mores and the
Right,
strictures that imposes in terms of behavior and selfhood and everything. Yeah, I
right.
mean, this is something that we've been exploring on this podcast recently. I find it interesting how this is something that's going on across quite different cultures. I have one more question along this line, and I think it's closely related, and it concerns victimhood, which seems to have an ever greater role in society today, and plays an important role, of course, in legitimating the rule of those in power in terms of responding to or protecting victims. Correct me if I've kind of put this in kind of the incorrect manner, but what do you understand as being the emotional structure that is associated with victimhood and victimhood culture?
That's interesting. That's a very interesting question. What is the emotional structure of victimhood culture? So I really don't think you can give a simple answer. I've never thought about this question, and I'm trying my best now. First of all, I think there is shame, which is quite stunning when you think of it. I mean, but here I'm talking about victimhood or being a victim, not victimhood culture, because I'm getting to victimhood culture. Quite often, victims are ashamed of having been the object of
Right.
a severe assault on the integrity of their body. So, of course, that is well known about women who are raped. That we know. But I was struck also by the fact that if you read testimonies of survivors of the Shoah, one of the things they say quite often, and the reason why there was silence for actually quite some time after the end of World War II, was because they were ashamed. So that I think is a just fascinating fact about the phenomenology of being a victim of an
Hmm.
assault. It is that quite often, instead of being angry, you are ashamed to have been violated. To go back to your question, I think victimhood culture is precisely about uh, erasing this shame
Mm.
and transforming it into the guilt of the perpetrator and putting at the center the guilt of the perpetrator. Um, so that I think that victimhood culture, I mean, when we say victimhood culture, I think that what we mean is that there is a kind of mixture of, on the one hand, presenting oneself as the victim of an assault, but on the other hand, enjoying it, enjoying the attention, enjoying the recognition, enjoying the compassion, enjoying the pity. But when we say victimhood, we are already not fully compassionate with the victim. And we are not fully compassionate, I think, because we suspect there is something that the victim is actually enjoying in putting herself in the position of a victim. But there is more. I think victimhood culture comes when it is possible and recommendable to designate a perpetrator and to actually create a relationship where you can accuse someone. And the accusatory mode, I would say, has become attached to being a victim, to being so there is this shift, I would say, from shame to making another person or entity guilty. I'm not sure I answered your
No,
question.
I think that's no, absolutely. I think, and I mean, it seems to me that it would be related to the commodification of trauma as well, and then, or even the kind of the prostitution of trauma, I guess, if you could put it in that terms. And it also seems to apply analytically. I mean, not just in terms of seeing oneself or choosing to be a victim to therefore be able to denounce or accuse, but also interpreting politics, interpreting society as a game of oppressors and victims exclusively, which seems to, it seems to me that traps us in those identities, that there's no attempt to really, within victimhood culture, to transcend those identities of oppressor and or perpetrator and victim, that it just demands perhaps at best some restitution, but no no transformation of that relationship.
But I think the way I interpret it is that it's a dilemma of democratic progress, because I'm not sure. I mean, it's a question. Could a victimized group have gotten the same equal of attention and restitution if they had not been integrated into a victimhood culture? In other words, there is a political claim, and then there is what popular culture does with it. A popularized and also popularized political culture. And so what I'm trying to say is, how would have the causes of Black people, for example, who are the victim of racism, how would they have advanced if they had not made themselves into victims? So, of course, they had to present themselves as victims. So maybe victimhood is this kind of capacity of a highly commodified public sphere to deaden and cheapen and empty, in fact, these political shifts and make them much less credible, because they become they become so connected to the market that we suspect them of having their own set of interests. They're no longer pure victims. They become people or groups of people hiding or pushing forward a hidden interest. I don't know if I make sense.
I think that's no. I mean, I think that's a compelling way of understanding it. I mean, I guess what I was trying to get at is that the perpetrator and victim. I mean, there's no obviously escaping from that. And to use the example of racism, we can say, well, there was a politics, a kind of universalist politics, which sought to challenge racism and restructure society, in such a way that there would be, or that politics would be pursued through creating solidarity between different groups, against an oppressive racist society, for example. Whereas the mode of identity politics today seems to me to be designed to set up to maintain people in their particular identity as victim and as perpetual victim, and cast the other as the perpetual perpetrator and oppressor. I think.
But here, I think there is a distinction that you introduced that I find very interesting. I think you could have cast yourself as a victim without using that fact as a marker of identity, which is what it has become. So I'm saying simply that we should mark the two things as different moments. And I think we do today as if marking oneself or a group as a victim, and this is what it has become, unclosed someone into a fixed identity. And this is how it has become. Again, I think the reason why there are so many problems with victimhood is that it is too strong of a boundary marker between you and the others, and that it really creates antagonism in the social bond, as opposed to creating mechanism, for example, either of healing or of forgetting. Because I think victimhood is about memory, and it is about woundedness and the memory of woundedness, and rehashing and rehearsing constantly the wound, to the point where when it becomes too often rehearsed, again it becomes suspect of no longer being connected to a real experience, which is, I
Yeah.
think, also the moment we are living in right now. Um,
Yeah.
so I think, I guess what you're saying and I'm saying is that we should have been able to, on the one hand, recognize victims for what they are, but not transform that into an identity.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's excellent, and a distinction which hadn't really occurred to me. And I think that's a very useful way of going about thinking about these things. Okay, so to turn to politics, and this I think is something that suggests itself quite naturally, given what we were already talking about. To turn to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has come to be understood, I think, especially nowadays, both outside and in, as far as I understand, in the self-understandings of the participants, of Arabs and Israelis, through victimhood. I mean, do you agree that this has become the predominant frame through which the conflict is now understood?
Yes, I think. Well, I think that Jews, first of all, are haunted by their history of victimhood and are entirely unaware of their force and strength. That is something that is not well understood by outsiders, because what outsiders see, of course, is the deployment of a fierce and brutal military power. But Israelis and Jews experience themselves as existentially vulnerable. As you know, there is an expression by the Austrian essayist Jean Amery, which I think describes well, maybe to a non-Jew, what a Jew feels like. And he says a Jew is a dead on furlough. It's a terrible expression when you think of it. And that is a little bit the ways in which Israelis think of themselves. They think of themselves as um, um, having to constantly defend their right to exist, and therefore as being entirely very, very vulnerable. Not vis-a-vis the Palestinians so much as vis-a-vis both the Arab world around them and the world in general. So that's for Israelis, because you cannot disconnect Israelis from the Jewish history, although it intended to precisely operate this disconnection. And Palestinians experience themselves as victimized because they are. They objectively are victimized, and they are stateless. They are rejected by also not a few Arab countries. They are mistreated by Arab countries. They are mistreated by their own leaders. And they are, of course, very much mistreated by Israelis as well. So, if you want, these victimhood identities maybe explain why also the conflict is locked. It's not the only reason why the conflict is locked, but it is probably one of them, one psychological reason why. But also because the Israelis and the Palestinians maybe do not always think of restitution in the same way. So for Palestinians, the narrative of victimhood starts with their dispossession of their land. And for Israelis, this cannot be the starting point of the victimhood because um, 48 is the year where Israel is created, and therefore some of the lands which Palestinians consider as legitimately theirs are not considered as such by Israelis. So, it's not enough to say victimhood. It is also, you need to specify. And I think if Palestinians view their victimhood as starting with 48, which I think they do, it becomes more difficult for Israelis to fully empathize or accept that narrative of victimhood.
Hmm.
By the way, I would add, but that again, it's interesting that you brought the topic of victimhood because I think that the two sides, when the two sides try to discredit the other, they often do it around the status of victimhood. So Palestinians will say typically about Jews that they have overplayed the anti-Semitism or the Holocaust card. And Jews also will typically say about Palestinians that they are eternal victims and that they don't want to leave their status of victims. So in a way, we have so much overplayed as a culture, but also in this specific case, this identity of victims that it's no longer taken seriously by the other side.
Excellent. No, that's very well put. I wanted to finish by asking you on a maybe on more of on a personal note for yourself, reflecting on the past year and events in Israel in particular, how your perception of Israel and perhaps even of being Jewish has changed, if at all.
I have to say that October 7th was for me an earthquake. Not so much because of the event itself. Of course, it was horrifying, but that is not what has shaken me to the core. What has shaken me to the core has been the reactions of the progressive left, which has, first of all, been unable to express compassion even for 24 hours. Um, in fact, in many quarters of the progressive left, there was glee and not compassion at all. Then the progressive left took the side of the Hamas, which is, let us recall, it is a group that has genocidal intent. It has declared them over and over again. It has written them over and over again. And to view them as a legitimate group of resistance was very, very perplexing. And then there were the calls, the many calls you could hear on American campuses to dismantle Zionism and to dismantle Israel, as if depriving people of a national home which exists was a moral thing to do. So there was a set of inversions on the side of the progressive left, which have been as dramatic for me as I would assume what a communist may have felt in 1956 when the Khrushchev report was issued and the murders of Stalin were known. In other words, it became much more difficult to believe in the ideology of the Soviet Union. So, of course, I'm not saying it has the same dramatic character because no one, because the progressive left has not killed anyone. But something happened to make that ideology much less plausible and credible and trustworthy and even respectable. Simply, so I've come to think that you can defend morality or think you defend morality uh, in a very immoral way with very immoral positions. This is my position today.
And where does that leave you, just finally, as a critic of the Israeli right, a critic of Netanyahu, uh, a critic of the way that Israel relates and has oppressed the Palestinians in this context in which a lot of kind of global left reaction to the 7th of October was, as you say, unable to express even any kind of sympathy, even briefly.
So that does not affect even a bit, even a tiny bit, my profound disgust at Netanyahu and his government. Um, it has made me even more. What it has done is make me convinced that the path forward can be found only by Jews and Muslims, Arabs, who are moderate, who believe in democracy, and want to fight fundamentalism in their society. That for me is the only path forward. It has not made me in any way more right wing or more sympathetic to the right by any means. It has made me convinced that the left needed to be completely reconstructed. And by the way, if the extreme right has become so powerful in so many places, I think it has to do with a failure of the left. It's not the only reason. Obviously, there are many other reasons, but one of them cannot not be that the left has lost its way. And October 7th, I think I already suspected that very strongly. That is certainly the case in Israel. That is something I discuss in my book. The reason when I try to understand why Netanyahu became such a plausible political option for the working class. I discussed the tremendous failure of the Israeli left, and I have become even more convinced of that this is not only about the Israeli left, it's about many lefts in the world after October 7th.
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree. And well, I think we'll have to leave this here. But I'd like to thank you for your time. It's been fantastic to speak with you. I would have liked to speak perhaps more about Israel and about your book, but maybe we'll have to leave that for another time. Eva,
Maybe another time.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.